Ladies and gentlemen, the millionaire invited the black cleaning lady as a joke. She arrived like a diva, and everyone was in absolute shock when they found out who she really was. The main hall of the Blackwood Mansion in Beverly Hills exploded with malicious laughter when Victoria Sterling descended the marble staircase wearing a dress that cost more than the annual salary of most of the people present. It wasn't laughter of admiration, it was pure cruel mockery. Look, who decided to show up. Richard Blackwood whispered to his guests, raising his glass of Dom Perignon champagne, "Our dear cleaning." Lady Victoria was 35 years old and never imagined she would one day step foot in that ballroom as a guest. Even if it was a joke for 2 years, she had cleaned every inch of that mansion, always invisible, always silent, watching those rich people treat each other with rehearsed falsehoods while treating her like furniture. The invitation had arrived 3 days earlier, delivered with a cruel smile. She knew all too well charity gala on Saturday. Richard said, handing her the gold envelope dress code, "Maximum elegance, you surely have something suitable in your wardrobe, don't you?" The laughter of his friend echoed through the hallway. It was an obvious trap, an attempt to humiliate her publicly, to put her in her place in front of California, high society. Richard had even invited social reporters to document what he called an educational moment. "Let's make a bet," Richard said to his wife Helena as Victoria vacuumed the day before. $100 Euro 0. She doesn't have the nerve to show up, and if she does, she'll be the entertainment for the evening. Helena laughed maliciously. "You're terrible, Richard. The poor thing will probably show up in something borrowed and feel so out of place that she'll leave within 15 minutes. But Richard Blackwood didn't know two fundamental things about Victoria Temps. First, she had grown up in halls like that long before she had to clean them to survive. Second, some storms don't destroy. They just teach you how to dance in the rain. As she walked through the hall under the mocking glances, Victoria kept her posture straight and her gaze serene, like someone carrying secrets that could turn that world upside down. His steps were sure, calculated, as if each movement were part of a long, rehearsed choreography. "My God, she really came," whispered Patricia Weston, wife of a senator, to her friend. "And look how she's dressed. Where did she get that dress? She probably rented it, and will pay for it in 10 installments, replied Vivian Chambers, daughter of an oil magnate, trying to disguise her own insecurity with cruelty. How pathetic. What none of those people knew was that Victoria hadn't borrowed or rented that dress. She had simply gone back into her own past to retrieve it, a past that Richard would have done anything to erase if he had known it existed." Richard approached her, his chest puffed out with arrogance, surrounded by his billionaire friends. His confidence was sky high. After all, he had orchestrated this as a public display of power and social control. "Victoria, what a pleasant surprise. I never doubted you'd come after all. When a person like you receives an invitation to an event like this, a person like me," Victoria repeated, her calm voice cutting through the air like sharp silk. "Go on, Richard, finish your sentence." For a microscopic moment, something in her tone made Richard hesitate. There was a firmness there that didn't match the submissive woman he knew from the halls of the mansion, but arrogance quickly took over again. "Well, you know, someone who doesn't normally frequent this kind of environment, you must be feeling quite intimidated by all this elegance." Victoria smiled, not a submissive or nervous smile, but something dangerously serene that made some nearby guests stop laughing. Instinctively intimidated, she repeated softly, her eyes meeting his with intensity that made Richard take a step back without realizing it. "No, Richard, I'm feeling exactly where I've always belonged." The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for the atmosphere of the party to change completely. There was something about the way Victoria spoke, the way she moved, the way she occupied the space, that defied all expectations those people had about who she should be. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Well, I hope you enjoy the evening. I'm sure it will be educational for you." "Oh, I'm sure it will be educational." "All of us," Victoria replied, her gaze slowly sweeping over the group of guests, as if cataloging each face for future use. "If you're enjoying this story of twists and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what those privileged people didn't know was that Victoria carried with her a secret so explosive that it would turn that night of planned humiliation into the greatest lesson on prejudice and underestimating people that Beverly Hills had ever witnessed. Richard was having more fun than he had imagined Victoria hadn't run away in embarrassment, as he had expected. She remained there with that strangely confident posture that was beginning to bother him in an inexplicable way. Everyone. Richard announced loudly, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal glass to get the attention of all the guests. I'd like to introduce our special guest tonight, Victoria, our dedicated cleaning lady. Laughter echoed through the hall like cruel waves. Cell phone flashes began to flash as socialites took photos to post on their social media accounts with sarcastic captions. Richard Helena murmured beside him, finding concern. Don't you think you're being a little cruel? Richard laughed loudly. I'm giving her the opportunity of a lifetime. When else would someone like her ever get the chance to attend an event like this? Victoria stood motionless in the center of the room, all eyes fixed on her. But instead of the embarrassment they expected to see, there was something disconcerting about her expression, a serenity that seemed to come from someone who had weathered far worse storms. Patricia Weston approached with her group of friends, all wearing poisonous smiles. Victoria, dear, tell me, how long did it take you to choose that dress? It must have been so challenging to find something suitable. Actually, Victoria replied with a calmness that made Patricia hesitate. This dress has a very special history. It belonged to my mother. Her mother, Vivian Chambers, laughed nasally. And where did her mother get a dress like that? At some fancy thrift store? Victoria smiled, but there was something dangerous in that smile. My mother wore this dress the last time she was in a ballroom like this. That was 20 years ago, when she was still Victoria Temps Black. Would the silence that followed was deafening. Some people stopped talking, realizing that something important was being said. Richard, who had been laughing with his close friends, turned slowly. What did you say, Thames Black? Would Victoria repeated, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. It's funny how some people choose to conveniently forget their own family history. Richard's face began to pale. Helena instinctively grabbed her husband's arm, sensing that something was terribly wrong. You're delirious, Richard said, but his voice came out less firm than he intended. I don't know what game you're playing, but this isn't a game, Richard. Victoria took a step toward him, and several guests instinctively backed away. Its history. Our history, the history you tried to erase when you decided it was more convenient to pretend that certain people in our family never existed. The cell phone cameras continued to record, but now for a completely different reason. Whispers began to spread through the room like wildfire. Helena pulled Richard by the arm. What is she talking about? She's lying, Richard replied, but his hands were shaking slightly. She's a deranged employee trying to get attention. Victoria reached into her small purse and pulled out an object that made several guests gasp. It was a ring, not just any ring, but the traditional Blackwood family engagement ring, engraved with a family crest and featuring the distinctive blue sapphire that had been passed down for generations. This ring, Victoria said, holding it up for all to see, was given to my mother by her father, Henry Blackwood. My grandfather, the man you told your children died without an heir. Richard was now visibly shaken. Where did you get this? How dare you steal? Victoria laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Richard, you can't steal something that is rightfully yours by birthright. Patricia Weston, who had been watching open-mouthed, whispered to her friend, my God, do you think she's telling the truth? Impossible, Vivian murmured, but her voice no longer sounded so confident. Richard would have told us if he had a cousin. Victoria heard the whisper and turned to them. Cousin? No, dear, I'm not Richard's cousin. She paused, dramatically looking directly at Richard. I'm his half-sister. The room exploded in murmurs and muffled exclamations. Richard looked as if he had been struck by lightning. This is ridiculous, he shouted, but his voice cracked. My father would never. You're making this up. Henry Blackwood had an affair with my mother, Isabella, for 5 years. Victoria continued relentlessly. She was the family's piano teacher. When she found out she was pregnant with me, your father promised to take care of us, and he kept his promise until he died. Helena now had one hand over her mouth, staring between Victoria and Richard, as if watching a car crash in slow motion. You, Victoria said, pointing directly at Richard, decided it would be easier to pretend we never existed. You cut off our allowance, sold a house your father bought for my mother, and left us in absolute poverty. I had no obligation to. Richard began, but Victoria interrupted him. You had no obligation to take care of. Your father's family interesting philosophy, considering you inherited 100% of a fortune that should have been divided between us, the weight of Victoria's words was slowly sinking into the minds of the guests. Several began to move away from Richard, as if physical proximity could contaminate them. With a scandal prove it, Richard said desperately, anyone can make up a story and come up with a ring. Victoria smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in her expression. Oh, Richard, do you really think I came here without proof? She took her phone and motioned to someone near the entrance. They can come in now. Each new humiliation of Richard only fueled something inside Victoria that he couldn't understand, a silent force that grew in direct proportion to the injustice. He tried to impose what those privileged people didn't know, was that every act of contempt was writing her own sentence, and Victoria had spent 20 years learning exactly how to collect every penny of a debt that transcended money. 3 people entered the hall at that moment that would change the lives of everyone present forever. The first was Diane Morrison, Beverly Hills' most respected investigative journalist. The second was David Chun, an attorney specializing in inheritance law. The third made Richard Blackwood stagger, as if he had been punched in the stomach, Dr. Hamilton. Helena murmured, recognizing the family's private physician, "What are you doing here?" Dr. Hamilton, who had treated Henry Blackwood during the last years of his life, walked to the center of the room. His hands were shaking, but his voice was steady. 20 years ago, I was forced to sign a falsified death certificate. Henry Blackwood did not die of natural causes. He was slowly poisoned with arsenic. Over a period of months, the hall erupted in muffled cries. Diane Morrison raised her hand. Please, keep your phones away. This is an official confession being recorded for legal purposes. Richard was visibly desperate, sweating. You're crazy, Hamilton. My father died of heart problems. Your father found out about the money you'd been embezzling from the company for years. Dr. Hamilton continued relentlessly. He had changed his will to include Victoria and was about to report you to the police when he began showing strange symptoms. Victoria remained silent, tears of relief in her eyes. Finally, after 20 years, someone was telling the truth. David Chun opened his briefcase and took out an official document. This blood sample was tested last week by an independent laboratory. The arsenic levels were fatal. You're making this up. Richard shouted, but his voice was completely uncontrolled. It's a conspiracy to ruin me. Diane Morrison stepped forward. Mr. Blackwood, I have transcripts of 5 conversations you had with Dr. Hamilton between 2003 and 2004, where you threatened to ruin him professionally. Victoria finally spoke, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Richard, you didn't just kill our father, you stole 20 years of my life. I didn't kill anyone. Richard pointed his finger in all directions. You're all lying. Then explain this, said Victoria, connecting her phone to the mansion sound system. A recording began to play. Richard's voice was unmistakable. Hamilton, you're going to keep your mouth shut about anything strange you found in the old man's blood. If you open your mouth, I guarantee you'll never work as a doctor again. And as for that woman and her bastard daughter, they'll have to fend for themselves. Silence that followed was absolute. Even the people who had defended Richard now shunned him, as if he were radioactive. Helena stared at her husband in horror. Richard, you really did this 20 years? Victoria screamed, her composure breaking momentarily. 20 years of cleaning my own father's blood off hands of his killer. Victoria took a deep breath and regained her deadly calm. You want to know how I got all this evidence? I didn't come to work here by accident. I applied specifically for this position. I spent 2 years preparing, gaining access to the house, collecting evidence. Richard tried one last desperate gambit. Even if all that is true, it doesn't change anything. The inheritance was distributed years ago. David Chun smiled for the first time. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, when there is evidence of murder, all assets can be redistributed according to the original will, and we have a copy of Henry Blackwood's actual will. Victoria approached Richard, who was leaning against the wall like a cornered animal. Do you know what my biggest mistake was, Richard? It was believing that you would change on your own. Please. Richard whispered, all arrogance evaporated. Helena, the children, this will destroy our family. You destroyed our family the moment you chose money over justice. Richard collapsed into an arm.